Good afternoon, and welcome to the final public events of the Religious and Psychological Well-Being Project, hosted by the Center for the Study of Religion and Psychology of the Danielsen Institute at Boston University. For the past 3 years, with generous funding from a Templeton Research Lectures grant from the Meta-Nexus Institute, a dozen people from Boston University have been meeting regularly to discuss the interplay of science and religion as regards well-being. Each year we have invited an eminent speaker to give a series of lectures on this topic, and so it is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Barbara Fredrickson. Dr. Fredrickson is the Kenan Distinguished Professor of Psychology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she is also the director of the Positive Emotions and Psychophysiology Laboratory. In addition to psychology, she is adjunct professor of management in the University of North Carolina School of Business. Professor Fredrickson received her BA degree from Carleton College and her PhD in psychology from Stanford University. Before coming to North Carolina, she taught at Duke and the University of Michigan, where she was also a professor of both psychology and business. She is the recipient of many awards, including the Templeton Prize in Positive Psychology from the American Psychological Association. Dr. Fredrickson studies and writes about many things, but primarily positive emotions and gender studies, and she is deeply interested in the connections between psychology and physiology. She is a prolific writer, having authored or co-authored over 60 journal articles, 27 book chapters, 17 smaller pieces, such as encyclopedia entries and book reviews, 2 editions of an introductory psychology textbook, 13 other publications currently in various stages of preparation, and certainly, not the least, her recent publication, Positivity, which was published in the year 2009 with Crown Publishers, and much of the material in this is showing up in these lectures. The cover features a quote from Martin Seligman, who many people consider the father of the modern empirical study of positive emotions. He said, "Barbara Fredrickson is the genius of the positive psychology movement." With a background like that, perhaps it's not surprising that this week alone she's giving 5 talks in 3 cities. I first heard her speak at a conference in Denver in the 1990s. She was early on in this process of work with positive emotions, but I remember thinking at the time, she's really got something here, and this has really turned out to be true. So many people have done work that has filled in this theory, both in her own lab and elsewhere, and it's really begun to affect the thinking of many people. But this kind of success takes time, and so she wanted us to know that she's actually on loan from her very patient family, 7-year-old Crosby, 10-year-old Garrett, and her husband of many years, Jeff Chappell. Her theme for her overall theme for the lectures has been how positivity seeds character development, spiritual transformation, and lifestyle change. She has already presented 4 lectures on this topic, all of which were videotaped and will be available online soon. And this afternoon she'll present her final 2 lectures, which will also be available online soon. So just a note about the online piece. That means we're taping, and that means there are a lot of people who will be watching and listening to this who aren't here. So if you have a question for her after her talk is over, we have mics on each side of the room, and we ask that you wait until you're actually at a microphone so that the people watching at home can actually hear what your question was, which will make her answer that much more intelligible. So thank you for helping us with that. So this morning, she presented a talk on the dynamics of positive opposites. Her talk now will be using positivity to bounce back from inevitable setbacks, and then I invite you to return at 4 p.m. for the final talk, A Blueprint for Character Development, Spiritual Transformation, and Lifestyle Change. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you back to the podium, Dr. Fredrickson.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be back, and I hope some of you, like me, were able to get outdoors for lunch. It's a phenomenally gorgeous day, and soak in some of that sunshine and positivity. I want to share with you in this lecture some of the work that I've done with my students over the years, looking at how positive emotions are a fundamental ingredient in what allows us to bounce back and be resilient. And what we can learn from studying people who are, for whatever reason, more resilient than the rest of us, and then how we can import what we learned from them into interventions with people who happen to be less resilient. And again, I wanted to, just as a backdrop, point out a distinction that I've made in an earlier lecture between there being two basic modes of being, physiologically two modes of being. People can either be in self-survival mode, this is sort of the fight or flight physiology, or in species survival mode, being more other-focused than self-focused, and Shelley Taylor has called this tend and befriend instead of fight or flight. And one of the themes that we're discovering is that, yes, these are two modes, but the species survival mode, or the focus on some positive emotions and love in particular, can help ameliorate stress responses that are no longer useful. Now, stress, fight or flight response when you're actually in danger is really appropriate, but there are times when it outlives its usefulness, and that's when kind of switching modes into accessing positive emotions and other focus can be very useful. And another way to think about these two modes, are, because using the phrases, is there love of life or fear of death? So are those the two tensions that are kind of enacted by that self-survival, being the fear of death, love of life being the species survival mode? And in a way, you can look at these also as an either-or phenomenon, that people are either acting as if they love life or fearing death. And I just want to, again, drawing on what my point was in the last lecture, is point out that maybe instead of either-or, we need to understand this as both and, that these are both systems operating within us and can be coactive at the same time. Here's a picture that helps remind me of the both and nature of the love of life and fear of death all at once. So the primary hypothesis that underlies some of the earlier work, the earliest work that we've done on positive emotions and resilience, is that positive emotions are an active ingredient within individual differences in resilience. That the secret that resilient people have, whether they can articulate it or not, is that they're able to tap into the broaden and build effects of positive emotions. And this work of our labs on resilience and positive emotions took an interesting turn around September 11th. And I just want to tell a brief story about this work. This was not, September 11th, 2001 was not too long after positive psychology had first started. I had been working on positive emotions for a number of years at that time. I happened to be on sabbatical that semester, and was thick into writing about positive emotions. And actually on the day of September 11th, I happened to be away from home in Minneapolis at a funeral of my cousin who had just died of cancer and had 2 kids. Actually his kids then were about the age of my kids now, so it was a pretty heart-wrenching place to be. And then, and that morning, as we're getting ready for the funeral, we are learning about the towers collapsing. So it was just a very underscored day. Of course, I actually had a plane ticket for later that day, September 11th. And so, of course, I did not get home by plane. I spent the rest of the day after the funeral trying to figure out, how am I going to get home? And called every car rental place there was, and there were no cars available for one-way rentals. I finally got what I was told was the last ticket on Amtrak that would take me from Minneapolis to Ann Arbor. So on September 12th, right after that big day, I was on a train full of displaced airline passengers. Of course, it was packed with everybody who would have been flying was on the train. And everybody was, normally I suppose people would be just kind of doing their work, kind of quietly, ignoring one another, but not that day. Everybody was talking about what was going on. Everybody was sharing their really fresh stories of who they knew in New York and DC that they were worried about and they hadn't been able to connect with yet. So people were talking like long lost friends, even though they just met each other. And that was definitely true with my seatmate as well. We were getting into these long philosophical, practical conversations about what America was going to be like. At one point he asked me, do you think people will ever be the same again? And I, for a moment, was struck by how often during the day I'd heard people elsewhere in the train cars laughing with one another. And I thought, people are already the same. They're hurt, they're suffering, they're feeling great compassion and worry about the future, but they're still laughing, they're still connecting with one another, and they're still able to move forward. So that was my first glimmer of hope, was that people were already the same. I got back to Ann Arbor after a day or two of just, like everybody wanted to just be with their family after that. So being away from family during September 11th was kind of tough. Got home, started to try to pick up the pieces of the papers that I was working on before September 11th, and they just seemed so trivial at that point. I can't remember which papers I was working on, but some small nuance about positive emotions. And it seriously occurred to me, this work just won't matter. Positive psychology just won't matter in this new era of terrorism. And I got really despondent about it. About another 24 hours passed before I realized that's just depression talking. I think I'm just a little depressed about what's going on, and was seeing everything as hopeless and without meaning. And then it suddenly occurred to me that I had some data on resilience earlier, collected just before 9/11. And it occurred to me that one of the things that I could do is test whether and how positive emotions were transformative and helpful, even in the midst of a crisis. And so what I decided to do as my own form of meaning-making and consolation after September 11th was to go back to the sample that we had tested earlier and do a prospective study of how resilience and positive emotions helped the participants in our sample that we had already gathered fare through the emotional roller coaster in the weeks after 9/11. So this was my own way of making lemonade in this situation, and certainly it really fit. This is the scientist's way to cope with disaster, is to collect data. The other thing I just want to point out is that the positive emotions that people experience in crisis aren't the jump for joy positive emotions, the prototypic, American rah-rah cheerleader kind of positive emotions, but they're quieter ones like these, where you're seeing people support and lean on one another, express compassion, feel grateful that they're safe, grateful that their loved ones are safe. So we're fascinated in seeing how the social and political situations unfolds after that. So these are very much the quieter positive emotions that I think we're able to see their effects here. So there's a lot of sadness in this photo, but there's also a lot of love and devotion, I would argue, as well. So I want to describe to you this serendipitous project that we did before and after September 11th. Earlier in 2001, we had a sample of more than 100 individuals. These were college students, and we had measured their trait levels of resilience, as well as their levels on a set of psychological resources that included their their optimism, their life satisfaction, and their tranquility. And within a matter of days, I was really grateful to have IRB approval to recontact these participants. The IRB met really quickly and said it was okay to get back to them. I measured people's depressive symptoms. I measured the same psychological resources that I'd measured earlier in 2001, and I asked people to tell me, since September 11th, identify all the emotions you've been feeling, the emotions related to the attacks and the emotions seemingly unrelated to the attacks. So we just wanted to know what people had been feeling since September 11th. And these data were collected. The earliest were within 5 days of September 11th, and then it went out for a couple of weeks. So, and that length of time of report didn't have an effect on the pattern of results, so I collapse across that. What we found in these data, the first thing we found was that psychological resilience assessed before September 11th predicted low levels of depressive symptoms after September 11th. This is just validation that resilience is an important trait, that it actually does predict who is more or less likely to experience depression in a situation like that. The more newsworthy thing was what we found next, is that this effect was completely mediated by the positive emotions, the greater positive emotions associated with trait resilience. Okay, so that psychological resilience predicts lower levels of lower levels of depressive symptoms because it's associated with higher levels of positive emotions in those days following September 11th. Okay, so again, this is perspective. This was before the crisis. Those emotions were reported right after the crisis. So we were able to predict really well that people who scored high on resilience would be the ones to experience more positive emotions, and those greater positive emotions accounted for the lesser depressive symptoms. We also found in this study that higher levels of trait resilience, psychological resilience, again measured before September 11th, was associated with increases in those psychological resources I mentioned: optimism, well-being, tranquility. And that in itself is remarkable, in that national polls at the time were reporting that feelings of hopelessness and depression, what I was experiencing when I was thinking my work was meaningless, that was pretty much normative for people after September 11th. And yet some people actually, after the crisis, reported more optimism, more well-being, and more tranquility than they had earlier in the year. They had shown sort of this paradoxical post-crisis growth. And what we found is that growth, post-crisis growth, was related to the degree to which people had experienced, was accounted for by the degree to which people experienced positive emotions in the days after. Again, this is full mediation, which suggests that positive emotions were the primary active ingredient here. I want to just point out some work by psychologist Anthony Ong that takes this work about the role of positive emotions in buffering against adversity. Same ideas of that resilience is enacted through the experience of positive emotions, and just say that he has done very similar work to the work in our lab, but with different samples, mostly older adults. And he's studied older adults dealing with major life events like losing a spouse and the bereavement that follows after that, and very minor events like daily hassles. And in both of those situations, whether you're dealing with big or small crises or bigger small life events, positive emotions in his samples were also the active ingredient that accounted for better outcomes. So this work is definitely has gone on in my lab and other labs as well. I want to turn now to some work on what I call the heart of resilience, looking at how resilience affects cardiovascular reactivity and recovery. This is some of my earliest work on positive emotions that certainly fits into this positive emotions resilience story. And in particular, I've argued that positive emotions, this is probably, Brian, the work you heard, and I'm thinking, Denver, what was I presenting back then? This was this finding, this undue effect of positive emotions. And that is that if negative emotions are narrowing our thought-action repertoire and preparing our bodies for specific action in that fight or flight way, positive emotions, and I'm arguing that positive emotions broaden people's thought-action repertoires, they should also dismantle this preparation for specific action that goes along with that fight or flight response. And if one marker of that preparation for specific action that goes along with that fight or flight response is elevated cardiovascular reactivity. And so our prediction going into this was that positive emotions should be efficient antidotes for those lingering effects, after effects of negative emotions. So when negative emotions are no longer useful, sometimes we still have cardiovascular reactivity kind of going on, perseverating, and the undue effect suggests, the undue hypothesis suggests that positive emotions should be able to work out to undo or erase those lingering after effects. In a way, you could think of positive emotions as working as a reset button to kind of quickly bring us back down to our own baseline. So I want to describe I've done a series of laboratory experiments on this. I'm just going to describe one for ease here, but you can rest assured that this has been replicated in a number of different ways. The typical study, we had people, these are college students, about 100 college students come to our laboratory one by one, and we assign each of them to prepare a speech on why they are a good friend under considerable time pressure. We give them 1 minute to prepare a 5-minute speech that they're going to have videotaped and judged by their peers. And we do everything to make people anxious, and it works. Okay, as you can imagine. So that's what we needed to create this backdrop of a negative emotion to be able to test the effects of positive emotions. So what we told our participants that actually there's a 50-50 chance that you have to give your speech, or maybe you'll be off the hook for giving your speech. And if a video clip comes on the monitor in front of you, that's your signal that you're in the no speech condition. Okay, so everybody was in the no speech condition, and everybody saw a video. But that was the cover story that we used to create this between participants manipulation of injecting either positivity into that moment, for some participants either a contentment eliciting film or a joy eliciting film, or by contrast a neutral state, which we used a very innocuous screensaver that just showed colored sticks piling up on one another. Or another negative emotion. So they kind of replaced or switched from anxiety to sadness. They saw a film clip that elicited sadness. So this is the way we, by random assignment, place people into positive emotions versus other comparison groups. And then our dependent measure in this study, the outcome measure that we were looking at, was the duration of people's cardiovascular reactivity. How long did the cardiovascular activity induced by the speech stressor task, how long did it endure? And we looked at that at a person-by-person level. Okay, this slide is to just remind me to tell you that the speech task works really well. It increases heart rate, it increases blood pressure, and increases finger pulse amplitude or vasoconstriction, all in the direction of increased sympathetic activation. And participants in this study say that they feel very anxious. Okay, so by self-report and physiological responses, we know that the speech preparation task works very well. But the question with respect to the undue effect is, how long does this cardiovascular reactivity last? And here's the bottom line of that work. What we did was looked at each person's duration of reactivity and created a time-based measure of duration of cardiovascular activity. And this is what we find is that those participants who were randomly assigned either to the contentment film or the joy film recovered some 20 seconds faster than those in the neutral and sad groups. And the most critical comparison here is between the positive emotions and the neutral state, and that is significant here and in our other replications of this finding. One thing that's actually very useful to know is that if you just showed these films, the contentment eliciting film, the joy film, the neutral film, those three in particular, not against the backdrop of speech anxiety, they have no cardiovascular signature. They really don't do much to the heart. There'd be no way that you could look at any of the cardiovascular responses to viewing those films and say, that's the signal that goes with positive. That finding in the past had led emotion researchers to say, positive emotions really don't do anything cardiovascularly. Okay, so they don't do anything to the cardiovascular system, but here we see that they can undo reactivity within that system. So they act more as an eraser, a reset button, rather than putting in their own signature there. So this is something new that we had discovered about positive emotions, whereas previous researchers, including my mentor with this work, Robert Levinson, had looked closely at the cardiovascular signature of positive emotions and concluded that it had none. Okay, so but by looking at it against the backdrop of negative emotions, we saw some effect there. Okay, I want to talk to you about okay, let me go back to this study. This was a study where we randomly assigned people to experience positivity or not, and we found faster cardiovascular recovery. In other studies, we found that certain individuals seem to capitalize on this undue effect of positive emotions more than others, and those are people who score high on this paper and pencil measure of trait resilience that we'd used in our other work that I talked to you about earlier. In case you're interested, the measure that we've used for that was developed by Jack Block and Adam Kremen. It's a very short 14-item measure of resilience that we found to be really potent in making predictions about who experiences more positive emotions. There's not a single item on the measure that has to do with positive emotions. So it's a neat way of looking at it. And in some work I did with Michelle Tugati, one of my former doctoral students, she found that people who score high on resilience show that same faster recovery following that time-pressured speech task compared to their low resilient peers. But what's most interesting, is not shown in this figure, is that people, everybody when they are faced with that speech stressor task reports feeling anxious. The high resilient people report feeling just as anxious as the low resilient people. Where they differ is that they also report experiencing being challenged and psyched up and interested, as well as anxious. Whereas the low resilient people just feel anxious, and they have very low scores on challenged, interested, and psyched up, which is the college student way to get at that good feeling of challenge. Anyway, what we found was that this difference here is mediated by their self-reports of positive emotions. So their positive emotions experienced in response to the stress task, the speech stressor task, accounts for this difference here. Suggesting again that resilient people are wittingly or unwittingly tapping into the undue effect of positive emotions. Okay, I want to turn now to some other work that we've done more recently on looking at we've done some brain imaging studies on people who are high and low resilient, and we learned some very different perspectives about how resilience works from these studies. So I want to describe those to you. These are the work of Christian Waugh, one of my former doctoral students, and this is his dissertation work that I'll describe to you here. And what Christian did was he was very interested in how people recover from anticipated threat. And so what he did was do a study where he selected high and low resilient people. We used extreme groups in this study. Not that I would recommend people to do that in the future, but when we had very few resources in the imaging, we had about 32, we had hours to scan 32 individuals through a grant, but we wanted to get as much power as we could, so we selected 16 high and 16 low resilient individuals. Reviewers didn't like that approach, though, just so you know. Don't try that at home. We posed threats experimentally, posed mild threats experimentally, and I'll give you a sense of how we did that. We did mild threats repeatedly, and then we could look at the patterns of blood flow associated with them. And then we assessed neural activity in particular areas. We were interested in anticipated threat and recovery, so we were especially interested in areas that would be connected to what have been called worry circuits in the brain. So the orbital frontal cortex is implicated in area and moments when people would be described as worrying. I'm going to use that as a shorthand. And then in 2 areas of the brain that show differences as people are experiencing negative emotions, both the amygdala and the insula. So we went in there with regions of interest based on past work. I want to just give you a sense of how we threatened people in the scanner, and it's pretty mild. What we did, Christian developed this task, which has been very fruitful for us. It's a very clever way of doing this. First, we had a cue period where people either saw, and this is counterbalanced, but here the triangle is a threat cue, and a circle becomes a safety cue. Participants are not told in advance that this is going to be a threat cue. They just, through experience, they see that this triangle always precedes one of 2 things. There's a 50-50 chance that you're going to see an unpleasant, aversive slide. Here is a corpse at in a unpleasant state, but it's in black and white and small, and I hope I'm not freaking anybody out. And so there's a 50-50 chance that participants for 3 seconds would see something aversive and very unpleasant, usually disgusting, or there's a 50-50 chance that they would see something completely innocuous, like a light switch or a bar stool or a chair. Okay, so when the triangle cue appeared, they came to learn eventually that there was a 50-50 chance that they'd see something aversive or something neutral, but that neutral was a surprise. It could have been either way. You know, Christian actually has one paper coming out on this research that's titled "The Chair That Could Have Been a Corpse." So it's just like, how do you react to that actually benign image when it could have been so much worse? Okay, and that is compared to other conditions within the same. Participants see all of these conditions, both safety cues and threat cues. The safety cue, the circle, always followed by a neutral picture. Okay, so they come to learn that whenever they see the circle, they're just going to see, again, some same innocuous thing, a book, a stool, a light switch. And these cue periods and intertrial intervals are jittered at different lengths, which is important for being able to know what you're measuring. Okay, so the entire task looked like this. There were threat cues, safety cues. Half of the threat cues were followed by what are called uncertain neutrals, and the safety cues are followed by certain neutrals. And a lot of our analyses look at the difference in response to certain neutral pictures versus uncertain neutrals. So they're all neutral pictures, but people's expectations going into them were different depending on what cue had preceded them. Okay, here's one way we looked at whether high and low resilient people differed. We looked at the temporal dynamics of the bold response, or the blood oxygenation levels in the insula and the amygdala. We didn't find any effects worth putting in a paper or talking about in the amygdala, so I'm going to focus here on the insula. This is during the uncertain neutral task for low resilient participants. This is just a way of illustrating the way we were looking at this, but what we found was more insula activity in terms of the width of activity in the bold response for low resilient people compared to high resilient people. So that's one way that these two groups differed. The low resilient people reacted for a greater length of time to the neutral pictures as if they were negative. Okay, so they're reacting to the neutral pictures as if they're seeing the corpse, but they're actually seeing a chair. Okay. Another thing we're interested in is looking at not the responses during the pictures, that's what I just illustrated just now, but people's responses during the cues. How are they reacting to the threat and the safety cues? Basically, I'm going to tell you more of a story about this slide, that the low resilient people during the threat cues showed more activity in the orbital frontal cortex on the left, which is past research has linked to greater worry. Okay, and we found that low resilient people, again, had higher scores on that. They are the black diamonds here as opposed to the pink squares. And across all subjects, there was an association between greater worry during the cue and greater insula activity during the uncertain neutral task. So that basically, the more they were worried in advance that they might see something negative, the more they responded to the uncertain neutral picture, the chair that could have been a corpse, as if it was a corpse. Okay, so again, that was true of the low resilient folks. The high resilient folks tended to not show much discrimination in orbital frontal cortex response, whether it was a triangle or a circle. So basically, during the threat cue, they were acting as if they're just looking at a triangle or a circle, and not as if they were about to be harmed or exposed to something unpleasant. And the lower the activity they had there, the more they were able to recognize the neutral picture that showed up after the threat cue as neutral. They saw it as neutral. This is one way you could look at, well, let me get to that in a second. What I think is revealed from this study is something about the mental habits of resilient people. And in a way, it's demonstrated best by understanding what low resilient people are doing. Low resilient people are already, they're almost assuming that that threat cue is a certain threat, is a certain aversive thing, because they're acting as though, okay, I got to brace myself, there's something bad's about to happen. But half of the time something bad didn't happen, and they're not able to quickly register that they are in fact safe. Okay, so what I think we see here is that among the mental habits of resilient people that this work suggests is that they worry less when their current circumstances are benign, meaning they're just looking at a circle or a triangle, that's benign, nothing's harmful to them in that moment. They're not bracing. They rebound quicker. We found that, actually I didn't mention this finding, but when the pictures were aversive, when they were unpleasant, there were no differences between the brain activity for resilient and low resilient people. So they didn't have a muted response to the aversive pictures. They were just as responsive as low resilient people to the aversive pictures. But when it was a neutral picture, they didn't also show the same response as if it was a negative picture. So that's what we're calling, they're rebounding from, they're able to see the neutral as neutral. Okay, and another way to say this is that their emotional reactions better reflect the nuance changes in the circumstances. Okay, so when it's benign, just looking at a circle or a triangle, they're just chilling. They think it's okay. They're not working themselves up in advance. Okay, when the situation turns bad, they react. They're emotionally nimble. They show just as much reactivity to the aversive thing as low resilient people do. And then when they're given a safety cue, they immediately are able to understand that they're safe. Okay, so they're emotionally nimble. And I'd like to argue that that's very akin to mindfulness. We didn't assess mindfulness in this study, but their patterns of blood flow are exactly what you would expect from mindfulness, this exquisite attunement to the nuances of the present moment. And in a way, it might be a way to understand equanimity as well, that, well, there's a cue in front of me, could be bad next, but I'm not sure, so I'll wait and see. So there's sort of a wait and see attitude, and then if it's negative, I'll mobilize my resources and respond to that. If it's not, I'll be emotionally nimble. So I think of another way to understand that is that what's going on with trait resilience is a level of discernment, of being able to more clearly see the current circumstances for what they are and not project onto them what a worry or a fear might be. So in this particular imaging study, we did not measure positive emotions. They weren't a big piece of it. We were really looking at how people are responding to negative emotions. But I think that to the extent that positive emotions open up people's awareness of their context, that too should allow people to get to this discerning state where you're able to really be responsive to the situation you're in and not your mental situation that you may be creating. Okay. Okay, I want to describe for a moment a possibility of spiritual buffering of negativity. And this is a paper that I want to thank Brian for pointing me in the direction of. Brian McCorkle has written a paper on spirituality and anxiety with Christian. And this paper that was cited in there really caught my attention. It was that these researchers compared spiritual meditation compared to secular meditation, compared to relaxation on people's levels of anxiety and pain tolerance and a number of other things, and how they operationalized these three. They basically had a relaxation, it seemed like a Herbert Benson style relaxation response training that they added on to different phrases. They gave people a choice of a number of mantras or phrases that they could use. In the spiritual meditation group, the phrases referred to God, like God is love. In the secular meditation groups, people had phrases like I am happy. And the relaxation group, they had no phrase. Okay, so they wanted to see, does it matter when people are doing these relaxation responses, whether or not they're conjuring up spiritual imagery? And some of the results they found were that participants in the spiritual meditation group, not surprisingly, reported more spiritual experiences. That's kind of a manipulation check. But they also showed greater drops in anxiety, more positive emotions compared to the secular meditation and to the relaxation group. And one thing that's most interesting, they showed greater pain tolerance. They had people doing a cold pressor test, which is basically keep your hands submerged in ice water for as long as you can. And they got twice as long of duration of being able to keep their hand immersed in cold water compared to the secular meditation or the relaxation. Now, I think there's a lot of mysteries in this study and a lot of possible confounds, but it points to further things that will be definitely worth exploring. It's unclear in this project how many people chose a phrase like God is love, but my question would be, how much of the effect is the God part? How much of the effect is the love part? So among the secular choices, I am happy, they didn't have an option that was I am love or some similar things. So there are some things that remain to me be unraveled here. And yet it's interesting that the kinds of mental imagery in space and the kind of connection people might be envisioning between themselves and the world during a meditation state seems to matter in some way. Although there's more to be unraveled. Okay, if all these things about resilience are true, we'd hate to be left at the place where we just understand why resilient people are great and the rest of us will just have to sit and watch them be so great. Maybe there's a way to build resilience as a trait. And the work we've done suggests that there definitely are ways to increase resilience, both in the moment and over the long term. So I want to start by sharing a laboratory study done by one of my former students, Michelle Tugati. This was part of her dissertation. One study in her dissertation I showed you earlier where we just looked at people who scored high and low on Block and Kremen's resilience measure and looked at how fast they showed cardiovascular recovery. And those people who scored high on the scale showed faster recovery mediated by their positive emotion experiences. This was an experiment where we tried to take high and low resilient people and randomly assign equal numbers of each group to the context again was a speech stressor task. Participants were high and low resilience. The between subjects manipulation was to use a classic distinction between giving them a threat frame or a challenge frame. So they're all told that they're going to have to give this speech under time pressure. It's going to be evaluated by their peers and so on. We make everybody anxious with that setup. And then we say, for the threat frame, it's really important that you do really well on this. People's performance on this task, predicts how well they'll do in college. And, so we amp it up. The challenge frame, by random assignment, other people were told, think of this task as a challenge to be overcome, something that you can, a surmountable challenge, something that you can get psyched up for and achieve. Okay, so it's a very standard way of manipulating challenge and threat based on past literature. And then for a dependent measure, we measured people's positive emotions they experienced about the speech stressor task and also the duration of their cardiovascular reactivity. And what we found actually was very interesting. One was that this challenge versus threat overlay really got in the way for high resilient people. It actually kind of messed them up. It's kind of like what they do naturally works, don't give them another task. They didn't get better with the challenge frame. They actually look like they got worse. But if you just look at the low resilient people, the people who showed that longer cardiovascular activity under normal circumstances, the challenge frame was associated with faster cardiovascular recovery and also with greater positive emotions, and those positive emotions mediated the faster recovery again. So we were able to take the optimistic part of the story is that we're able to take low resilient people and give them a reframe of the situation that actually has their emotions and their cardiovascular reactivity look virtually the same as the high resilient folks. And the other lesson that we learned from that study is that sometimes when you try to re-describe what's working to the people who are high functioning, it just gets in the way. So I think there's an interesting lesson in there. There's another study I want to tell you about briefly, is one that we call Happiness Unpacked, because happiness is often viewed as, in positive psychology, as this amalgam of positive emotions, high positive emotions and high satisfaction with life. And then in a way, positive emotions are sometimes just taken as another sign of happiness or life satisfaction, that they're interchangeable, that you can either measure people's positive emotions or their life satisfaction, but they're really just, it's a chip off the old block. It's just another facet of life satisfaction. What we've argued from the broaden and build theory is that there's a lot more going on with the relationship between positive emotions and life satisfaction than meets the eye, or what comes off the page in a lot of positive psychology work, and that is that positive emotions build resources. And I focused a lot on this in lecture 3 in the series last month, where I built the case that positive emotions over time accumulate and compound and build people's resources, helping them become the best versions of themselves. So if you look at happiness in this way, positive emotions can be related to life satisfaction directly, but they could also be related indirectly, because positive emotions build resources. Having more resources at our disposal to deploy when we're facing life's challenges is what can make life seem satisfying and fulfilling, is because we can address challenges when they come up. So this is the model that we tested. I want to just share with you some of the data that support it. Here we measured emotions daily over the month, and we measured resilience at the start of the month and at the end of the month, as well as life satisfaction at the start of the month, at the end of the month. So we were able to get changes in resilience over a 6-week period, and changes in life satisfaction over the same period, and see how emotional experience related to that. And what we did was we divided our sample into those who, over the course of a 1-month period, experienced the most positive emotions to the least positive emotions, and divided those into quartiles. And we found that predicted change in resilience. This is just a fancy way to portray a correlation. So higher positive emotions during the month predicted change in resilience. Okay, we use the same fancy way to portray a correlation over here, where we now take resilience quartiles, the people who showed the greatest increases in resilience. We see their levels of change in life satisfaction. And here we find that change in life satisfaction is best predicted by change in resilience. And when you put these together in the mediational in a mediational test, we find basically support for this model, that greater positive emotions over the month lead to increases in resilience. That increase in resilience is what makes life more increasingly satisfying. So again, we call this happiness unpacked because a lot of researchers will look at positive emotions and life satisfaction as just one big jumble. And what I would like to argue is that there's a mechanistic process going on, that if we look at the process and understand the pathways through which positive emotions lead to increases in life satisfaction, we can see more about how human psychology works. Okay, we also have found in our studies that, and again, back in lecture 3, I gave you the details of our intervention where we use loving kindness meditation. We have found that resilience is one of the resources that can change with loving kindness meditation in a replication of that earlier study. Okay, so one of the things that I want to just sum up here is that the things that we learn about how positive emotions and resilience relate to one another is that positive emotions can buffer against depressive symptoms. They can fuel post-crisis growth. We see both of these in the September 11th study. They also fuel cardiovascular recovery. We also find in the same in the brain imaging studies that they are predicting kind of a neural calm, like just being able to be calm in the face of a potential threat cue, and predict faster recovery. So we see that undue effect both at a cardiovascular level and at a blood oxygenation, blood pattern level. And here's a question. It's possible that these effects may be stronger still if the positive emotions are in some ways conceptualized by the person as spiritual positive emotions. And another way to look at this is, I think that points to the direction that we need to look at whether some positive emotions have better buffering and undoing effects than others. And where I would look at that in my lab is whether love as a positive emotion has more potent effects than some other positive emotions. So that might be what's going on in that study where people are repeating the phrase God is love or similar phrases, that it actually could be that love aspect, the distributed positive emotions, rather than the more individual positive emotions. They could have even bigger buffering and growth, inspiring and recovery effects. So with that, I want to thank you for your, this last thing, resilience can change. We know that too. So that gives that sense of added hope to this whole picture. But I'd be happy to take your questions now.
So we have two microphones, one here, one on the other side. If you'd like to ask a question, please come up.
Thanks for an interesting talk. You've spoken about the effect of meditation. And then you made some implications about what type of meditation, what one was thinking, love, God is love, or different. I was wondering whether you've looked at imagery, the imagery that one may think about or picture in their mind, either during meditation or aside from meditation, but just as an activity unto itself.
Right.
Because I've read that, to calm down, think of a beautiful scene that you really enjoyed and where you were calm, or think about succeeding in the following endeavor, whether it be an interview or a job or a task. Think about it, and that heightens your ability to succeed in it, or at least so the literature has said.
Right.
What are your thoughts on it?
Right. I think that's a really potent way to self-generate positive emotions, to do it through imagery and to be kind of working with the kinetic physiological states, kind of visualizing. I mean, in the loving kindness practice, there's a lot of emphasis on focus on your heart region and feel your breath into your heart region and notice the sensations in your heart region. And so part of that is visualization, part of that is just drawing attention to the body. And I think those are great, vivid and concrete ways to increase the ability to self-generate positive emotions. Now, I haven't myself done any studies where we test the effects of having imagery components in the meditation or not. I really took the loving kindness practice kind of hook, line, and sinker and compared it to a weightless control group in our earlier work. In our next studies, we'll compare it more rigorously to mindfulness meditation, looking at a meditation practice that has all the same formal aspects, concentration, time spent on oneself, maybe time in a group, but one has much more positive emotion in it than the other. Not that mindfulness is devoid of positive emotions, it's just, again, a lower level, I think, than loving kindness meditation. But we definitely didn't see as fitting our aim here to understand what are the actual aspects of the practice that were driving it. We were first just looking for an effect of positive emotions. So I think depending on what your research question is, that'll help define, what are the right comparison groups. So it's a great question, but it wasn't our question.
Oh.
So.
And no one else has been working on this that you're aware of. And there also, I wanted to add the fact of the type of imagery. So whether it's individual or devoid of people or group-oriented, just like, spiritual is a whole class of imagery.
Exactly.
So there might be other factors there,
Yeah, I think that's a great question for future work. This is the way I would reframe it as, how much of I view, as I shared this in the first lecture, I view love as an amalgam of all the other positive emotions that are experienced in relationship, in a safe relationship. And so how much is that added context, the relational nature of positive emotions, which I think, whether it's shared interest, shared pride, shared joy, all of those you could redescribe as love. And so is it that social context that kind of gives it more of traction to help people recover from depression or recover, show these bounce back effects or to grow? I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's a great way to look as we build in this area. So.
Thanks. And did you just mention in your answer weight loss group?
Group, yeah. Actually, there is a study I've been trying to get funding for that would look at whether positive emotions experienced in group weight loss programs would help predict who's going to benefit from that the most. So places that use a sort of a talking circle, almost an AA model, that social sharing of positive emotion and support, try to find out, is that the active ingredient that helps group support do its job? So that sense of caring that's going on there. So if we can isolate that a little better, we can make sure to bring that active ingredient better into the groups as they function and operate.
Yeah, I would just think off the top of my head that there may be some differentiation between group support versus degree of positive emotion, since group support can take many forms and still be supportive.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, you were mentioning love as an amalgam. In terms of resilience and the things, do you think there's any difference between imagining giving love or getting love?
Yeah, I do. This is very much inspired by my collaboration with Stephanie Brown, who has worked on the question of, worked in the area of why is it that close social contacts are promote health. And the presumption, she's argued that people just kind of jumped to the conclusion that it must be the social support you get. And she's done some very detailed studies to show that controlling for the social support you get, it's the social support you give that is associated most with the health benefits. And that even though we understand most of the science on caregiving is associated with the burdens of caregiving, that's been completely confounded with having a spouse or a partner debilitated or suffering from dementia a lot of times. And so when you control for that and really look at the extent of giving, there's actually health benefits to being a caregiver that have been hidden by confounding it with just loss of the health of your spouse. So I do think that to the extent that this other focus is might be the driving way to get us into that species survival mode, into the self-survival mode. Kind of getting resources from others kind of says, help me survive. Giving resources is more tipping into this other system. Actually, Stephanie and Brown and I did a series of experiments related to our cardiovascular undoing work, where through a clever laboratory manipulation, she found a way to have people give help to another or not give help to another, and that help would either be effective or ineffective by either getting another person out of an unpleasant task. So first you had to get to know, you're randomly assigned to be with a particular partner in the study who you didn't know, and you did a closeness task, so you started to care about that person a little bit. And then you did a series of other studies where your performance on this task, the speech stressor task, is going to either help your partner avoid something painful, like hearing loud noises, or not. Or your performance on this task has nothing to do with your partner. It's just your own success or failure. And in a way, we had kind of a Fredrickson hypothesis pitted against a Stephanie Brown hypothesis, which was, well, if positive emotions were driving it solely, then if your help was successful and you were feeling like an effective helper, then you should have the fastest cardiovascular recovery. What we found was, compared to people whose performance on the task didn't help anybody at all, sort of the, wasn't even connected to helping, those people showed protracted cardiovascular recovery after the speech task. That I can now just say the speech task because you've heard of a few versions of that. But both the groups who helped and succeeded and were successful, or helped and didn't succeed, and they were actually feeling very crushed, like, oh, I wanted to help my new friend, and I didn't, they showed faster cardiovascular recovery too. So it suggested that it wasn't successful helping, it was attempted helping, it was giving, it was, in a way, the thought that counted. I tried. I tried to help my friend, and that kind of, she's arguing here that kicked in this other-focused mode that might be an especially effective way to reduce excursions of cardiovascular reactivity and be more of that sense of buffering. And that's part of what gives me a sense that it could be that these connection positive emotions are the most efficient way to tap into this beneficial effects.
It just reminded me of something I wanted to share that connects with this morning. I'm an animal lover, and had a big long talk with a vet about how I couldn't possibly be a vet because of, and the vet looked at me, he smiled, and he said, well, he said, it's different when an animal comes in and it's injured and you know that you can help.
Yes.
And basically what he said was that his knowledge that he's had experience helping blanks out the negative. It almost actually takes energy from the negative and puts it right. So it's sort of like the positive and the negative coming together in that.
Yeah, and exactly. This is what the thing that I think is most interesting from the studies that we look, when we look at resilient people after 9/11 or resilient people in the laboratory when they're responding to the stressors, they're not feeling just good or bad. Right. They're feeling both. And so they're kind of addressing the difficulty with positivity. And so they become an interesting blend. And that blend is, I think, what drives.
And actually what that stuff is valiance mature coping mechanisms.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there is a way in which this flexibility and blending and bringing those dialectics, again, is what we're seeing as psychological maturity. It's a great connection. Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious, is there any studies that you've done or know of about teaching resilience to children in an academic setting at specifically a young age?
Yeah. I am thinking a lot about Carol Dweck's work, which you sound like you know about, where you're thinking of failure, you're construing failures as temporary setbacks and that sort of thing. So in a way, it's similar to this resilience as discernment, because you're seeing the failure as momentary rather than characterological. And so that would be the closest analogy. And I think that helping people see difficulties as momentary is a way to unlock some of that. Because again, the core feature that we see again and again with resilient folks is exquisite attunement to the nuances of the situation. I mean, that is Jack Block's definition of ego resilience, which is the scale we measure. And Interestingly, the experiences of positive emotions help people be able to have that discerning response. And so kind of teaching the discerning response in a safe environment, or in an environment where people can step back and say, that's not all there is about me that I just failed on this test. I have other good attributes. Now let me understand what that says about me. It's not ignoring the difficulty, but it's kind of putting that failure or hardship or difficulty in broader context. And that's what I think resilient people are able to do, is kind of see that big picture, and by consequence then that failure or that difficulty becomes appreciably smaller and surrounded by other good stuff. You know, that when we take off those blinders and see the rest of the world, we're like, okay, it's not that bad. What can I learn from it?
And do you think that can be taught to an elementary age child, those skills?
I think so. Things that teach learning orientations to failures. I'm not a developmental psychologist, so I don't know exactly how to go in there and work with kids that age, but I know that there are different approaches to developing that learning or incremental orientation, learning orientation. I think there's, this work would suggest that positive emotions and widening the lens to look at areas of success in one's life would be a good way to do that in addition. There's some work on giving people strengths feedback versus weakness feedback, and whether it's best to do both together or just strengths alone. My colleagues at Michigan's business school have worked on this reflected best self exercise with adults mostly, but they've done it also with college students. And in a college student sample, they found opposite of what their prediction was, that the mix of strengths and weakness feedback was the best combination. That having just strengths without discussion of weakness wasn't as successful. And I think it could be that positive response helps, and the negative together helps them get real traction on the issue, whereas the positive alone seems kind of maybe, oh, can I really believe this person's got the whole picture in mind, because it may not be so balanced. So,
Just following up on that other question, I wonder if the distinction you were just drawing parallels in some way what you were speaking about this morning in differentiating between guilt and shame, where one leaves the person with a sense of spoiled identity,
yes,
and the other does not. And
exactly.
I would assume it's much more difficult to recover from a sense of spoiled identity
Exactly.
than a mistake.
Yeah, that is a great connection. That's exactly the difference between, again, emotions that are very connected to the nuances of the circumstance. They don't necessarily say things about your character and your identity. On the positive side, you can look at that distinction between what sometimes is called, pride is a positive emotion that has a bad rap sometimes, right? So there's hubristic pride or arrogant pride, which in a way is saying, well, this good thing happened, everything about me is good. It's the opposite of this shame, taking it as a bad mark on your identity. This is just taking it too far and saying, I am just great in everything I do. But then there's really specific pride, which is, I just did something that I can take credit for. That's neat. Okay, let it go. And then have it move on. So there's one that's more would ebb and flow with situational changes, and the others are kind of hung on to as either shame, I'm bad and I'll always be bad, or hubristic pride, I'm great and I'll always be great. Those kind of things that are disconnected from the nuances of the circumstances are the ones that I think can get us in the most trouble. And I think I would argue resilient people would do that kind of arrogant pride a lot less, but I don't know of any data on that. It's just my hunch.
I was just wondering if you had any comments on the following thought, which may be way too simplistic, but I just wanted to get your feedback. Since we see that resilient people focus more on what really is at the moment and don't particularly anticipate what might be
Right.
as much, is it possible that just educating people on those facts and then doing exercises or behavior modification type things, demonstrating it in various circumstances, not just in a half-hour session, but say in a teacher, doing it in various situations that just arise in the class. Some kids are at odds, or a student misbehaves, or a student's feeling bad, and let the class see that anticipating the future, especially as being bad, isn't realistic and is certainly not helpful, even if it were realistic.
Right.
And focusing on the real of the right now
Yeah.
is the way to get through it. And also, I think most people, especially children, tend to feel that the hurt is going to last almost forever.
Right.
Whereas experience tells you it might last a few hours,
Right.
maybe a few days, in rare circumstances longer, but you've been alive so much longer than any of these things, it's just going to pass,
Right.
even though it's not pleasant until it passes.
Right.
And these are just matter-of-fact things. I don't hear much about people teaching these
Yes.
obvious things.
Yeah. No, that's a great observation. It reminds me of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression, which it has a lot of the same elements that you're talking about. This is just a thought. It doesn't necessarily connect on to what's going to happen next. But I don't know of any work that same sort of deliberate kind of unhinging of thoughts from emotions has been used in that same kind of mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy with kids in the classroom. But I think there's every reason to believe that the kinds of lessons that are in that treatment, which is to prevent depression relapse, it's really not developed to treat depression, but to prevent depression relapse. And therefore, it's really about the ups and downs of daily life. Mm-hmm. And so you could take that exactly and bring it into sort of classroom training. And in a way, a colleague of mine in the field, Kevin Rothunde, has this work that I mentioned earlier about experiential wisdom. That's what you're trying to convey to kids, is that, actually, this doesn't go very far with my own kids, though. It's like, well, I've been around 45 years. I've noticed that this doesn't happen so much after that. And it's kind of like the Buddha said, you have to discover it for yourselves, but kind of pointing out,
Yeah.
like this, did you notice that you thought you were going to be upset forever?
It's not an immediate fix, but it allows them to think about those things rather
Yeah.
than it's going to solve it. And I would speculate that a lot of people have some of those same issues when they worry. So you're trying to achieve greater resilience in people and greater life satisfaction. And I wonder if the majority of people may not realize this as consciously.
Yes.
And if it was made more conscious to them,
Yes.
and they allowed them to just do with it as they wish, but have experiences where they see it at work, whether this would help society to some extent.
I think it would. I think there's a way in which we're trained to very much identify with our thoughts, and that if I think that this upset is going to last forever, then that's the way it is, and I'll act as if that's true. It takes a bit of perspective to what the phrase that's used in the mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy is decentering, and that's a way of disidentifying from thoughts or thinking. That if you have an urge to lash out or whatever, you see that as a thought. Oh, that's what happens when people get angry. They get that's what happens. They want to get even. Oh, okay, that get even thought is going through my head. You can just let it go through your head as opposed to act on it. So that's definitely that sort of decentered thinking is a way of not identifying with your thoughts. I mean, I teach this in my graduate level positive psychology class, and my very wise graduate students are often saying, oh, okay, I don't know what I am if I'm not identifying with my thoughts. I mean, as an academic, I guess that's what we've bred them to do, is to really identify with their thoughts and have unique thoughts and write those thoughts down and publish those thoughts. But the idea of just letting thoughts go through and seeing an aspect of being beyond those thoughts was totally new to them. And these are really wise 20-year-olds. So, you know, if you can get to them young, that's all the better. And then send them to me.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
So I'm interested in the last part of your talk on building resilience, and I have two questions. One is, you talked a lot about the concept positive emotions, but not very much about what that actually means, how that's operationalized. So probably that was the subject of your last 4 talks, which I unfortunately couldn't come to, but I'm wondering if you could give at least a 1-minute summary so I could get an idea of that. And the second is, in how one builds positive emotions, you talked about meditation, and I'm wondering if you think that's the best way to increase positive emotions, or if there's other options, or...
Right. Good questions, and thank you. It gives me a chance to contextualize this a bit further. When I'm measuring the extent to which people are experiencing positive emotions in daily life or since 9/11, I'm using a short measure that I have on my website, positivityratio.com, that measures 10 different positive and 10 different negative emotions. And those positive emotions range from joy, amusement, interest, serenity, pride, love, compassion, hope, probably forgetting one. But anyway, a whole range of more social positive emotions, serenity, quieter positive emotions, and more typical high activation positive emotions. So it's covering a whole range of flavors of positivity, if you will. And so I'm asking people how much they've experienced those in today. What was the greatest amount of that emotion you experienced today?
Well, it sounds like you think love maybe is the most central of those ones that you mentioned. Is that true? Or?
That is my current hunch. I have a little bit of data to suggest that all of the published work that I have so far doesn't discriminate amongst the different positive emotions. They all seem to broaden. They all seem to build. There's one study that I've conducted more recently that for a while I was just feeling bad about this data set because I wanted a sample of 200. It ended up being a sample of 70. So has a lot less statistical power than the studies we did with 200. But in that situation of lower power statistically, the one emotion that emerged as kind of doing the work of building resources were people's self-reports of love. So in a way, when we have more statistical power, all the positive emotions show that effect, but that may hide the fact that love actually leads the way. That's the one that shows the most potency even in an underpowered statistical situation. So there's a little bit of evidence that love may be stronger, and that's a direction I want to go in to really see whether that's true. I think there's a lot of theoretical reason to say that this distributed positive emotion, the one that automatically brings you connects you to others, would have a greater effect. Your second question was about
how to build positive emotions.
How to build positive emotions. Do I think meditation is the best way? Well, the challenge that I had in testing the build effect of positive emotions was needing to basically create a lifestyle change for people, to increase their daily diet of positive emotions. And that's not as simple as it seems. It's like reading cartoons every day or something like that may not do it. So I really think that finding a technique that allows people to self-generate positive emotions no matter what the circumstances, even if life is lousy, even if life seems really ordinary, even if things are going really well for you. I think there's a way that this practice of loving kindness meditation works in a wide range of situations. I can tell you that we did 2 or 3 earlier attempts before we did the study with loving kindness meditation where we thought we had a way to increase people's positive emotions reliably over the course of the month. It worked for a handful of people. For most others, it didn't. We had people doing positive reframing of ordinary events, things that theoretically should have worked given the scientific literature on reframing, but they were just difficult things to enact in daily life. I think the key, and I describe a lot of this in my book, Positivity, is to personalize your attempts to self-generate positive emotions. And we weren't doing that at all in our earlier attempts. So one of the things that I think is true is that we all know the things that would bring, if we just give ourselves a moment to think about it, we can think about the things that bring us the most joy, the most fascination, the most sense of serenity and awe. But we just don't allow ourselves to do them. But if with a little bit of self-study, people can figure out, okay, these are the things that would work for me. So in terms of personal advice, I think meditation can work really well, but also really careful self-study about what are the things that make you come alive. That can be a really quick route to finding places to increase positivity. And I describe ways to do that in the second half of my past book. So, thanks.
So it's now 3 o'clock, and I'm afraid we'll need to give our speaker a pause so that she can come back at 4 o'clock and deliver the closing lecture in which she's going to pull all of this together in some wonderful way. So I invite you all to enjoy the beautiful day outside and invite you to come back in an hour. Thank you.
Thank you.